Okay, then I think I'll quickly start with introducing the event and our guest speaker. So welcome everyone. So this to a new discussion with the European Debate Initiative. So we're a group of students initially from the University of Amsterdam who founded this platform, and we always want to raise attention on certain regions in Europe and certain topics that we consider important. And today we're very honored to have a really, I would say excellent writer and thinker from the region, from Moldova, Paula Erizanu, who has been working as a journalist and writer and published lots of new articles and also books on the political situation and the cultural sphere. So very warm welcome from our side, and thank you for being here with us today. So today we want to put the focus on Moldova because it's one of those European democracies right bordering Ukraine on the, maybe let's call it, edge of Europe, but also very crucial on a very crucial and historic path at the moment towards EU integration, but facing unprecedented challenges. So we are very happy to welcome Paula to maybe give us an insight on the situation. And before we start, I'll quickly give you an overview. So this will be moderated, the discussion, by myself and my colleague Clara. And we do encourage everyone to participate. So if you have questions, either write them in the chat or raise your hand. So we're happy to give you the floor. And we encourage students to also engage with the practitioners from the region. And then I'll give the floor first to Clara, so you can introduce our guest speaker.
Yes, before I do that, I just wanted to say that Francesca will take care of the political part and the political questions, and then I will follow up with more questions about the culture and your work in the cultural field. And yes, but now to Paula. Thank you so much for joining us today, and also welcome to everybody else who is here with us. So we have the honor to have you here as a guest. Paula is a journalist and author. She has done a lot of work. She's been writing for The Guardian, the Financial Times, BBC, CNN, and she's from Moldova. She was born and raised there and has studied in the UK and is now, from what I know, London-based, but if that's wrong, please correct me. And
I was based in London for 10 years, but now since the war started, I wanted to be back with my family in Moldova. And also it made more sense as a journalist to be based here rather than let American reporters write about Moldova without having any background context.
Oh, definitely. Oh, that's interesting to know. Yes. So, but you have studied in the UK and you were also a culture editor of the Harvard Journal for 3 years until 2022. And yeah, there's a long list of achievements that you can proudly show. So yeah, you've published a book on the 2009 protests in Moldova titled "This is My First Revolution, Steal It." But then later you've also coordinated, or she has also coordinated, a 3-part anthology called A Century of Romanian Poetry Written by Women, together with Alina Pucaru. Correct me if I'm mistaked the pronunciation. And you were also nominated for the Words by Women Award as UK Cultural Journalist of the Year. And yeah, we are so excited to discuss generally your work and especially your expertise now, and also how the war changed your focus. And yeah, I will give directly the floor to Fanny to dive into your work and the political situation in Moldova deeper.
Thank you so much for your interest, guys. It's really great to see young Europeans take an interest in Eastern Europe and in Moldova.
No, thank you for being here. So then I do, maybe let's start with the hardcore politics, because also the reason why we thought it could be interesting is because Moldova is quite in the focus, and it has been in the past year more and more. there's actually a big summit coming up on the 1st of June. So probably Moldova will once again be more in the headlines. And we've always seen, how also Russia tried to interfere in the current situation. So the challenges, I think, are quite daunting. So, but before I make it too complicated, maybe for Moldovan experts and people who are just interested in the region, could you give us a brief, maybe overview of the current situation? Like what has happened over the past year? What would you say are the biggest, challenges that country is currently dealing with?
Yeah, sure. So Moldova is probably the second country that has been most affected by war after Ukraine. We're very small, 2.6 million people. That's the population. Without Transnistria, it's not really clear how many people live in Transnistria, which is this autonomous region in the east, so between Ukraine and the river Dnistru, and where there was a war between Russia and Moldova in 1992. When I was born, my mother could literally hear the shelling from the maternity ward as she was giving birth to me. And that war was transformed into a frozen conflict, basically. So Russia insisted on a peace treaty, which has meant that for the past 30 years, the Russian army is still stationed in Transnistria. So we have 1,500 troops there. And we still have 20,000 tons of ammunition, Soviet-era ammunition, in Kobasna. It's like the biggest depot of ammunition in Southeastern Europe. Russia agreed, signed international treaties to withdraw its troops, to withdraw the ammunition safely, but it never actually followed up on that or executed that commitment. And so, of course, when the war first started last year, there was a lot of fear surrounding Transnistria and whether it would get involved in this. It would basically create another front in the war or not. There is a so-called government there. Moldova doesn't control that territory. There's a lot of kind of black market trade, including of arms, drugs, and so on. And there was a lot of anxiety surrounding Transnistria's role. But actually, as time has passed and the front line has moved further east in Ukraine, thanks to the Ukrainian army's defense, there is less kind of military anxiety surrounding a potential invasion of Moldova via Transnistria and of involving Transnistria into the war in Ukraine. And the biggest kind of challenges for us are, there are lots of problems, but let me start with 3 or 4.
Okay.
One is political, and that is something that is has been shared by Zelensky, by the US, by Moldovan President Maia Sandu, and that is the ways in which Russia is trying to destabilize Moldova politically through kind of semi-fake protests and foreign kind of citizens coming into Moldova in order to spark violence and kind of create instability and so on. But so far, it looks like our public institutions have been quite good at rejecting a lot of foreign citizens who wanted to come into Moldova and break havoc. And so the security concern is not at the front of ordinary people's minds. Instead, what ordinary people are concerned with is inflation and the energy crisis. So for 30 years, Moldova was almost fully dependent on Russian gas. And also we got our electricity from Transnistria. So literally we were just fully dependent on Russia for our energy supplies. And Russia has always used energy as well as economic means to kind of blackmail Moldova into accepting various kind of political moves so that Moldova remains in the orbit of Russia, and we always got punished when we tried to come closer to the EU. But last year, like a lot of Europe, our gas supplies were reduced, and so our authorities had to buy, well, for some time there was actually fear that there might be a humanitarian crisis and we might not be able to get any gas for the winter. But our authorities did manage to get gas on the international market and electricity from Romania, some of it at relatively kind of cheap prices, but most of it was really expensive. And so people's bills increased by 6 times in 1 year. And that has obviously led to inflation. Now, thanks to Western support, the government did subsidize people's bills, winter bills, but still a lot of people struggled economically. And because we're importing all of our energy and not controlling Transnistria, that has meant that our inflation has reached something like 30%. So that is the kind of main concern for most Moldovans now. And I, for instance, went to some of these protests organized by pro-Russian party. Well, it's interesting. Basically, now we have a reformist pro-European government, and they have committed to fighting corruption. So what is happening politically is that our oligarchs who were controlling the country in the past have kind of allied themselves, and also some of them have allied with Russia in order to oust the current government, which was legitimately elected by people. And so I went to some of these protests organized by the Shore Party, one of the oligarchic groups that has sided with Russia, and that is probably using Russian funds as well. And I interviewed people there. Investigative journalists have proven that there were lots of people who were paid to be there, so they received a certain fee. There was this, there is a caricature artist in Moldova who even made a kind of a graphic which showed how the Shore Corporation works, and how at the very top, Ilan Shore, who is this oligarch who's now hiding in Israel, and who was charged with 15 years in prison for participating in a big money laundering and kind of financial fraud scheme.
Yeah, it was up to 10%, no, GDP that he took.
That was stolen, from Moldovan banks.
Yeah, I think like just that number, if you have one person stealing up to 10% of a country's GDP, I mean, you can imagine what that would be for Germany. So yeah, it's actually fascinating that he's still, free in Israel. And that he still has influence in the country through his party. So just as a background for everyone,
Yeah. And he's not stopped there. it looks like he's involved in bankrupting Moldova's air flight company as well. So it's more than 10% of the GDP. But basically, the graphic that I started speaking about, done by this caricature artist, showed Shore at the top with like getting $1 billion, like the famous kind of theft that he was involved in, and then all sorts of people down the line in the political party. And then at the very bottom, you had these kind of elderly ladies and who would get $20 for showing up in protests. So, you know, this is all part of the kind of corporate scheme running the party. They're being investigated for accepting money from a criminal organization at the moment. I'll stop here. I can see that questions.
Maybe, yeah, there was one actually directly related. I think, John, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, yeah, I can just unmute myself. Yeah, you mentioned that Shore still has a political party in Moldova, and I was wondering, like, how does he exert influence through those party structures? You mentioned one way that he like pays people to like attend rallies and demonstrations, but like how does he exert influence through like these party structures, and how is that legal to have a sentenced billionaire still being like ahead of a party essentially? Is there a way, like there's a legal process to like maybe stop that party from existing? I don't know exactly, but so that's why I'm asking.
There was an initiative to outlaw the Shore Party last year, and the decision is yet to be investigated by the Constitutional Court. But they, you know, they might just switch names. They might like, I mean, still, it slows them down to kind of have to go through all of that paperwork and so on. And he's not an MP anymore. He was stripped of that status. I mean, he never showed up for any of the assemblies, so he was paid public money for nothing. But then he has 6 other MPs in parliament. So that's 6 out of 101. So it's not a big party, but it's very loud.
Yeah, I mean, you maybe to add on that, because you mentioned the protests are paid, they're paying citizens basically. So how, I mean, what does that say about Moldovan population? I mean, you mentioned, of course, the difficult inflation and energy crisis, but if people have to be paid to protest, what would you say is the general, you know, perception of the government? And yeah, like, would you say there's a big backing behind this, you know, oligarchs and pro-Russians, or is it more like a fringe that's just very loud?
Sorry, I was just making my dog's food, and now I'm I've stopped the fire. Yeah, it's a good question. So I think it tells that we have a lot of poor people in Moldova, and especially pensioners. So a lot of people who are now in their 80s or 70s and so on, they would have lost all of their savings overnight when the Soviet Union collapsed and the economic system collapsed. So they can only rely on state pensions, and those are very low. That's why some people accept to come and protest in Chisinau. It's basically the money, the financial kind of reason, motivation. But in addition to that, Russian propaganda is very powerful everywhere, but especially so in the former kind of Soviet republics, which haven't been as radical as the Baltic states in outlawing it. fully. And so when I was reporting, from these protests, I remember interviewing a counter-protester who was also a pensioner. And so he would have struggled economically as well. But he was staunchly pro-European. He was saying, finally, we have a government that is taking the right steps in the right direction, and we just have to be patient and resilient, and we'll kind of move into the right direction to develop our country and make it more prosperous and a more democratic and stable place. And then there was a protester who told me, during the Soviet Union, I was doing so much better, and we should go back to being friends with Russia because we paid cheap gas and electricity then. And I was thinking, what is the difference between these two people? They are both struggling economically. And the difference is the TV channels they watch or the newspapers they read. And I really agree with Peter Pomerantsev on this issue, who said, now we have to kind of make a legal argument that a Russian propaganda is basically used in the war machinery. And so it's an extension of the war machine. It's not just it's not media, it's something else. And so it should be banned. And Moldovan authorities did ban news and political talk shows coming from Russian state TV, and they also banned 6 TV channels which were all linked to the shore kind of people, and also were Russian retransmissions, but everything was done in a kind of untransparent manner. And so the Audiovisual Council didn't know who the final beneficiaries were. They didn't get a permit from the Audiovisual Council and so on. And they were controlling a lot of the kind of advertising market, the majority of it, and had really big ratings because people just kept looking at Russian TV channels out of inertia following the fall of the Soviet Union. And so those 6 TV channels were banned, and then news and political talk shows coming from Russia were banned last year. But entertainment, for instance, was allowed to continue. And as Peter Pomerantsev, whom I mentioned earlier, shows, entertainment is very aggressively used by the Kremlin in its propaganda. You can't distinguish between the two. And also, some people have moved, who are like staunchly pro-Russian in Moldova, have moved to watching these same journalists on YouTube. Still, there is a reduction in number because those people who watched these TV channels out of inertia rather than out of a real choice to absorb that information, they are probably unlikely to keep watching the same kind of content. But also there's another kind of side of the issue. Russian entertainment has like high budgets, and so their TV shows are quite cool and
quality-wise, so it's
like big shows, and so we need to kind of have something to replace that, right? And I, for instance, watch Romania's Got Talent, and like Romania, well, anyway, some kind of music shows. And a lot of Moldovans go there, and that's quite interesting that you'd get this integration and this fusion. Actually, a lot of Moldovans dominate the Romanian music market, the pop music market. It's quite incredible. And
maybe just to add here to our audience, because how many percent of Moldovan population speaks Russian, and how many speak Romanian? What would you say is the ratio? And how does that influence the effectiveness of Russian propaganda?
Yeah, it's about, I think, 75%, 80% of people who speak Romanian, and then about 15% also who speak Russian, maybe 20%, and they are not necessarily Russian ethnic, but they might be Ukrainian ethnic or Gagauz ethnic or other ethnicities which were Russified during the Soviet Union and also later on.
And I have a question on that as well, because not long ago, Moldova officially now changed its official language from Moldovan to Romanian. And like, what does it mean? Does it even mean something, or is it purely symbolic? Or what do you think?
It's more symbolic. We're kind of tired of these identity debates in Moldova. Russia has tried to kind of divide people and kind of spark those debates a lot in Moldova, and also in a kind of post-colonial manner. My parents' generation would have really embraced its Romanian heritage, which was banned during the Soviet Union. And so during the perestroika era, they went to literary musical clubs and they sung all of this kind of Romanian folk songs, and they would have spoken about historical repression during the Soviet Union that hadn't been spoken about before. So anyway, so we've had these debates for a long time. And I learned Romanian at school, for instance, and all schools in Moldova have Romanian language and literature as part of their program, rather than Moldovan language, which was what my parents' generation would have learned in the Soviet system. But in the constitution and in laws, we had this kind of Soviet relic, the Moldovan language, which does not exist, and which was just invented by the Soviets in order to prevent any kind of national feeling between Moldovans and Romanians, to kind of insist that we are something different and that we belong to the Soviet kind of peoples rather than to Romania, of which Moldova was a part in the interwar period.
Yeah, because now you mentioned that your parents were speaking Moldovan at home and then you learned Romanian in school. Like, how different are the languages? Because they're basically the same, but like how much differs?
My parents were not speaking it. They were, this is what their language course was called.
Okay. No, then
yeah. The difference was that the Soviets imposed the Cyrillic alphabet, but that didn't really suit Romanian, which is a Romance tongue. There were certain sounds which you couldn't write in the Cyrillic alphabet. Anyway, and that's the only difference. And then, yeah, there's an accent, but the accent is in many ways similar to the way people speak in the Moldovan region of Romania. So people in Iași, for instance, would speak in a similar way to my grandma.
Okay, thank you.
Isn't there also a Moldovan region, I think, in Romania? Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe adding on that, because now we touched on a lot of issues. I mean, starting with Transnistria, the energy crisis, and I mean also the Russian interference, and then the corruption and this oligarch shore. I mean, it's always I think, interesting to remember how close Moldova is to Ukraine. And I think we saw this at the very beginning of the war, when up to a lot of Ukrainians went through Moldova as refugees, and then before going to other European countries. And it's very close to Odessa. So of course, I think that was the biggest threat at the beginning, what happens to Odessa, because that might affect whether Moldova could be pulled into the war. But I mean, all of this also had the result that now in July 2022, Moldova and Ukraine received EU candidate status. I think this was the war played a big role in this. And you have a pro-European government, and you mentioned, their fight against corruption and the path they chose. So maybe to add on this, what would you say? Is this like a historic opportunity, having candidate status, and what does it mean in practice? And maybe what are the hopes Moldovans have when they think of, Europe and the EU integration path? And yeah, let's start with this, I think.
Yeah, maybe I will mention two other historic moments in recent Moldovan history. That is 1991, when we got our independence from the Soviet Union. There was a lot of support for the reunification between Moldova and Romania, minus Transnistria. And so, for instance, on the 6th of June, I think, 1990, we had this kind of flowers bridge between Moldova and Romania. And for the first time, people from those countries spoke to each other freely for the first time in 45 years since the Soviet occupation. My parents were also there, and so many other people. There were 1 million people there, so a huge part of the Moldovan population, and also a huge crowd from Romania. So, but we kind of missed that boat because Ion Iliescu, who was the Romanian president at the time, he had studied in Moscow. He was probably linked to the Moscow kind of network of agents. And so he rejected all of Moldovan authorities' claims for reunification at that point. And since then, there's less support for the reunification with Romania, but instead there is the majority of the population of Moldova supports EU integration. And here I'm going to mention the 2009 mass protests that we had and that I wrote about. For me, that was one of the key formative moments for Moldovan civil society. We went out on the streets. There were about 70,000 people there. In the center of Chisinau, in order to protest against rigged elections. So this relatively pro-Russian party, the Communist Party, had ruled Moldova for 8 years. I say relatively because they kind of became a bit more pro-European by the end of their rule. But anyway, they wanted to stay in power for another 4 years, despite the fact that people did not vote for them. It was a bit like what's happening in Belarus with Lukashenko. And because of our protests, they didn't manage to get the one vote they needed in order to create a government. And so we had renewed elections and a series of pro-European coalitions ruling Moldova since then until 2019. So for 10 years. I remember one flag I saw made by this contemporary artist at the 2009 protests. There was this flag of Moldova where the blue was turned into the European Union flag, but there was a hole in it, which kind of expressed the this feeling of stolen dreams and stolen future that young people in Moldova felt at the time. So in a way, I would compare these protests to what was happening with Maidan as well. Like obviously not to that scale, without quite as much violence, but these are key formative moments in nation building, because nations are not just what their past is, they are also in the making, and these moments can kind of create a new vision for a country's aspirations. And so the war in Ukraine has indeed become an opportunity for us to get closer to the EU and to pursue EU integration. But there are challenges, as always. One of them is the reform of the judiciary. So this is the kind of the big reform that this government has promised to pursue before the war started and we had hundreds of thousands of refugees come here, and therefore they had to deal with the refugee crisis and with security threats more than with the judiciary. But now, and then the energy crisis. But anyway, now that winter is over, people are once again speaking about the reform of the judiciary. What they're trying to do is basically to create this pre-vetting process, which means that judges and prosecutors have their wealth analyzed, assessed, and compared to their wealth declarations and their salaries, so that by an independent body formed of both Moldovan and international members. And the idea is that by going through this process, starting with the top institutions in the judiciary and going further down, we will get a clean kind of judiciary system with judges that have integrity and not judges that are corrupt, and who have basically allowed for these oligarchs to steal more than 10% of our GDP. And that is difficult because the judiciary should obviously be kind of independent from the other political branches, from the executive and the kind of legislative. And so, and also there's a lot of resistance from the judges and from prosecutors to this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's touching on kind of one of the core, I think, elements of a democracy, like a functioning judiciary. So I see why, this is an essential element on the path to EU accession. And I think this was also one of the main points that the government, the pro-European government in Moldova had raised in the election campaign, that they want to fight corruption and improve the judiciary. And so I think it's very interesting what you mentioned about how this maybe joining Romanian idea turned into, being pro-EU integration, which also shows that, EU integration is a path of, opening borders and joining, this club of maybe more stable democracies. I would like to ask maybe now from the audience, I encourage you, if you have any questions on the things we already discussed, feel free to join.
A question from Zoe.
Yes, Zoe. Go ahead.
Thank you. Kind of along the lines of what you were talking about, European integration, I was wondering about maybe the international, you could say, standing or reputation or talks about Moldova and how that, and whether it affects the domestic kind of political situation or political discussions, like has the war in Ukraine and yeah, as you said, the fact that with many Ukrainian refugees, has that changed the domestic discussion as a consequence of maybe more international attention to Moldova? And yeah, just your perspective on that.
So before the war, whenever Moldova was presented in international news, it was to do with this kind of corruption, big-scale corruption, or with its poverty. The fact that we are the country with the highest refugee per capita, even slightly higher than Poland, because our population is so low, and we have 100,000 refugees on our territory still. This has become the first kind of positive cliche about Moldova internationally, the fact that people just wanted to help their neighbors. And it wasn't wealthy people. It was like anyone who had a car or an extra bed. I was filming an interview with this family with 8 children who have had something like, what was it? Something like 40 refugees cross their house basically throughout the war, because they lived in this village right next to the border. And then I interviewed a Ukrainian artist who makes disability visible and who's disabled herself, who was staying in this village with a family together with her husband, who's also disabled, and her parents. And these people who are hosting them managed to get a kind of movable bed from the hospital in order to help her kind of make her life easier with getting up of bed and out of bed and so on. So people have done like huge efforts in order to help Ukrainians. Something else that the international media has focused on regarding Moldova is the security threat. And that hasn't really helped, because often international headlines would be quite scaremongering. And actually one feels safer living in the country than reading international kind of news headlines about the country from that respect. And also because of these shore protests, they have also received a lot of international coverage. And so that creates this kind of idea that Moldovans are pro-Russian because there are always these anti-government protests in Moldova. Not everyone reads the actual news story, which might mention that some of those people are paid for and so on. So because of that, Maia Sandu is organizing this kind of pro-European assembly on the 21st of May, where she's trying to unite all of the pro-European political forces in the country. She's met up with civil society actors, with cultural figures and so on, asking them to join the pro-European assembly and to invite others to join as well. So in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, so 1989, 1990, 91, we had these massive national assemblies in Moldova, which basically led to, were part of the movement for independence. And so when Sandu announced this march, she made a clear reference to those assemblies, saying this is our European National Assembly. I also see it as a continuation of the April 2009 kind of protests that I took part in. And so her kind of point with this assembly is to show to her EU partners who tell her, Maia, why are your people protesting against you, and are they pro-Russian or not? She's like, she wants to show that actually Moldovans are also pro-European. When I first heard this news, I was a bit baffled because I was like, no one goes out on the streets to demonstrate in support of one's government. That is quite unheard of. But now that I've seen so many people kind of speak about why they will join, I think actually maybe it's quite a good discussion to have nationally. Like, basically we're discussing our vision for the future, and that can also help with our international image as well.
And about the international image, I would like to steer the conversation a little bit in the cultural part, because you've been really, really active in the cultural field, especially before the war broke out in Ukraine. And yeah, you've been working on underlining the Moldovan and Romanian, as well as more generally the East European culture and the importance of it. And like partially also through the anthology that I mentioned in the beginning, but you also participated in the coordination of the project of 100 books to read from Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So like you've done a lot to underline the visibility of, more broadly the region. And that's why I was wondering, why is it so important to do that and to underline the cultural visibility and the general visibility of that region abroad?
Yes, so with my work at Calvert, I just try to give a voice to artists and kind of creatives from the region, because ultimately creativity comes from everywhere. There are vibrant cultures everywhere, but we live in a world that is dominated by the English language and people who produce content in English. And so my work with Calvert was basically trying to shine a light on the talent in Eastern Europe, in Moldova, in Romania, in Ukraine, and other countries in the region, and try to kind of cover this region in a more nuanced, enriching way. My anthology, A Century of Romanian Poetry Written by Women, these are 3 volumes that I've coordinated with Alina Forcaro, and our kind of decision was basically sparked by this idea that was commonly voiced in Romania and Moldova, that there aren't many Romanian language female poets around. And when we started working on this project, fellow poets would tell us, oh, you're not going to find anyone, or half of them shouldn't be in your project probably, or like you'll end up with like people who shouldn't be given a platform to, or because their poetry is so bad. And actually, initially, we only wanted to do 1 volume because we didn't know that we'd find so many voices actually who have been forgotten. And then as we kept doing our research through the archives and in vintage bookshops and secondhand bookshops and so on, and via friends and libraries, we realized that actually this is this deserves at least 3 volumes. And I'm not going to sound very modest, but I think we have contributed to changing the perception of Romanian poetry written by women, and of feminism in Romania and Moldova, because we haven't been aggressive in our kind of feminism, as a lot of misogynists fear feminism is, but instead we just have this kind of concrete proof that, look, there is so much good poetry that has been written by women, and all you have to do is to discover it. And the fact that this project exists doesn't mean that men will stop being published. It's just adding to the diversity rather than reducing it.
And then it seems like it was also something important for you for the region itself, like to be created for there, but also for abroad, because it was also translated, like it's English and Romanian, right? There were 2 different
No,
editions?
it's just Romanian at the moment.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, but then with the English, I got confused because of the title written in English everywhere where I
No,
read about the anthology.
Yeah, it's probably just because I tried to promote it. So someone did a similar project in Spanish, taking some inspiration from us, and we have spoken to people working for the Romanian government about potentially translating it into English as well. But we'll see.
Yeah, that's always a bit difficult as well with poetry. Yeah,
and
yeah, such a
100 female poets. You know, it's a lot of copyright to go through. Yeah. So there was
a very
another
beautiful
question
project
from Zoe, right?
Yes.
Yes, if I can, if you don't mind, I have a question going a little bit to the politics again, about the EPC, the so-called European Political Community, the idea that President Macron launched back in May, and then they had their first meeting in Prague in October, and now the next one is to be held in Moldova. And it seems so far it's still, well, a flexible idea, but that the host country also has a role in shaping the outcome. So I was wondering, maybe from your perspective, what are the Moldovan ideas or expectations on this, for this whole concept, given its special role as a host here on the first of June?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of anxiety here in Moldova, especially amongst the organizers of this summit. We just want it to go well, but I'm not sure. Like there are so many infrastructure kind of challenges here that make it so difficult to organize that summit here. I wanted to go well because of Moldova's international image, and a lot of Moldovans would say the same, but yeah, there are so many challenges. Some of them are quite interesting. So international kind of I forget the word. Anyway, so different kind of countries might actually join planes, for instance, share kind of rides so that they put less pressure on Moldova's infrastructure. But what the kind of Moldovan government says it wants from this summit is to kind of anchor itself in the European family. So publicly, I mean, I've heard kind of mixed views. Some people told me that they want to push for certain kind of reforms to help with regional security, including for Moldova, and some other forms of interconnectivity to do with phone tariffs and so on. But other kind of high officials said, oh, you know, it's just important to anchor ourselves in the European family and kind of foster these networks and give back and show that we take responsibility and we can take a lead as well.
I mean, it's maybe to add there, it's interesting because Moldova is, for instance, a member of the Council of Europe. So they are already included in like maybe some, you know, old European institutions that are quite important. And they have a summit just a few days before. So I think it will be interesting, pretty much the same group of state leaders that will go to first Iceland for the Council of Europe and then to Moldova for the political community.
Yeah, it's different ends of Europe.
Yeah, very different. So let's not speak of the CO2 footprint of that. Maybe to, if there's no more questions from the audience, unless I missed something, I would ask maybe a final one on, you know, what the West and the EU could do to help Moldova on this path, because I think it's quite positive that, you know, we have a pro-European government, that the majority of the population is supporting this path, and that they've been incredibly supportive of Ukraine, also publicly, you know, taking a clear stance against the Russian aggression. I think all of this is not easy when you're 100% dependent on gas before the war, and then, you know, are so close to Ukraine. And what would you say should the West do, and what do Moldovans maybe expect also from the EU and maybe allies in Western countries in terms of support?
Yeah, I mean, I think just a lot of kind of financial and financial support, and also kind of expertise in helping Moldova with its security threats, with the resilience and diversity of it, and accessibility of its energy sector, and also with overcoming the economic crisis sparked by the energy crisis, and making advances with the judiciary reform. We need help on all of those aspects. Yeah, in some areas it's to do with economic and financial support, and in other areas it's to do with human resources and expertise. And the EU and the West is helping, but they can always help more. And yeah, I am a bit anxious because economic pressure can actually make some people turn away from Europe and say, oh, you know, it's too high a price to pay. And if the EU can help with releasing some of that pressure, then maybe people wouldn't change their geopolitical options. And also, I think we need support in the information kind of security sector, because this week we have elections in Gagauzia, this southern autonomous region populated by Turkic people who have been Russified during the Soviet Union and in the past few decades. And this region has received a lot of economic help, disproportionately more economic help from the EU compared to other areas in Moldova. So they have, they have like some really good roads, a lot of projects, infrastructure projects that are just kind of better developed than neighboring areas, which are pro-European, but haven't received the same kind of support. And still, this region is very pro-Russian. Why is that? Because no one tells them about the EU funding for their projects on TV. You know, they watch Russian TV, and so of course they're not going to see any EU help there. They're just going to see kind of scaremongering bulletins about gay Europa and so on. So the kind of economic help has to go hand in hand with ensuring more information security and less Russian propaganda here. The government needs to take a lead in this, but the EU and Western partners can definitely help.
No, I think this is a definitely very good point to make, like that it has to go hand in hand also with the information that you convey on, you know, what you're doing and why. Yeah, no, thank you so much for these last insights. And since we're running out of time, maybe very final note, what is your advice maybe to students interested in the region and in Europe, and what would you advise them as, you know, a writer and journalist who maybe herself has, you know, is still looking for yeah, I don't know, what would your advice be to students basically?
Oh, I don't know. I feel like for this question, we'd need a separate meeting where everyone introduces themselves and you tell me what you're studying, what your aspiration is, and then, you know, we can discuss individually what you can do given your dreams and so on. I think there's a kind of solution that fits everyone.
No, that's
but if I just wish you to be confident and resilient and keep going, because yes, the job market is tough, but at the same time, there are always opportunities, and maybe, you know, you're not going to get your first job, your dream job as your first job, but if you do something that really interests you, you know, that might be not quite as glamorous as what you hoped for initially, don't despair, because maybe the glamour will come later.
No.
It took me years before any of my pitches about politics in Moldova were accepted by international outlets. I will put it that way.
Yeah, I think it's a good inspiration if you, yeah, your example to others that, you know, keep believing and in this, yeah, what you're doing, and I think eventually you'll get through. If you also you build up, of course, your expertise over the years and your experience. No, I think I just want to thank you for your time and all your great insights. And it's great that you are on the ground again in Moldova. I think also for Moldova, that's a good time to have so many people working towards, you know, this brighter future. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all the interesting questions from the audience. And yeah, Clara, if you want to add.
Yeah, also from me, just I will underline everything that Fanny just said. Yeah, thank you so much for being here, taking the time, and also thank you for everyone else to have joined this interview or this conversation.
Yeah, thank you as well for your interest, and I'm sure I'll see you in further meetings when you're doing amazing things in various government bodies or think tanks or newspapers and so on.
No, we'll be happy to stay in touch, and yeah, if anyone goes to Chisinau, then maybe it's nice to meet you.
I am actually meeting international kind of journalists and analysts every week in Chisinau now. I think I'm meeting more people here professionally than I could be meeting in London if I were there at this time. So yeah, Chisinau is a hotspot now.
No, I can imagine. Yeah, well, we wish Moldova also good luck with everything, and you for your writing, and yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Yes, for the audience, maybe this is a quick introduction. Like, if you want to follow the European Debate Initiative on social media, we usually do events once a month. So feel free to join, follow us there on Twitter or Facebook. And we will have a discussion in end of May on with a very experienced expert on Russia's role in Africa, because we've been seeing, how that has influenced also how the conflict in Ukraine also has a global scale, and maybe what Russia's role is in there. So follow us and you'll be informed about the next event. And thanks again.